October 31st, 1517, a monk named Martin Luther nails a list of objections on a church door and dares the most powerful institution in Europe to answer. He thinks he's starting a debate, but he's actually starting a revolution. In an age where heresy meant death, why wasn't Luther burned for his defiance like others before him? And how did his public protest ignite a movement that split Christianity, fueled wars, and rewired Europe? To find out, let's go back to where it started. In the late Middle Ages, most Europeans lived with a constant sense that life could end suddenly. Famine, disease, and wars had trained people to think in urgent spiritual terms because death did not send a warning. The Christian Church was the central institution that organized time, morals, learning, and community life. Religion was not just a Sunday thing. If you were born, married, or buried, the Church was there, and most people assumed that staying connected to it was tied to their eternal fate. In Western and Central Europe, at the top sat the papacy, surrounded by bishops, priests, and monastic orders. They dealt with land, money, and politics. That system did genuine good, but it also created obvious abuses. Some church offices looked like prizes. Some leaders lived like nobles. Even faithful believers could see the distance between Christian ideals and the behavior of certain officials. Criticism of church corruption had been rising for generations, and voices kept asking, if the church preached humility, why did it look like a money and power machine? In the late 1300s, England, John Wycliffe argued that Scripture should outrank church tradition, and he criticized the wealth and politics tied to church leadership. His ideas were condemned after his death, leaving a clear paper trail of forbidden reform. A generation later, in Bohemia, Jan Hus pushed similar themes in a far more explosive environment. He preached against corruption and demanded moral reform among clergy. He gained a large following, and that made him a public problem rather than a private critic. Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance, tried for heresy, and in 1415 he was condemned and burned. The point was not subtle. Challenges to church control could be ended by force. Back in the 1500s, this shadow fell across Luther's world. Educated Europeans knew Hus's fate and understood the logic behind it. When Luther later posted his theses, he stepped onto ground that had already been scorched, and he needed more than good arguments to survive. To understand why his challenge had a different outcome, we have to understand Martin Luther's personal background and core beliefs. He was born in 1483 in Eisleben, in what is now Germany. His father worked in mining and wanted his son to rise through education into a stable profession. By the early 1500s, Luther was moving toward a respectable career in law, which was exactly the kind of social climb his father hoped for. But in 1505, a sudden event tipped his life. During a violent thunderstorm, he panicked about dying unprepared and made a vow to become a monk. Soon after, he entered an Augustinian monastery. He became a priest, earned advanced degrees, and began teaching at the University of Wittenberg. The more he read, the more he focused on a single problem that felt personal and urgent. He argued faith was crucial because a person was made right with God by trusting God's promise, not by buying, bargaining, or stacking up religious credits. Luther still argued that good works mattered, but as the result of faith rather than the price of salvation. Yet the most consequential was his idea that Scripture sat above church traditions. By the time indulgence preaching heated up in the region, Luther believed people were being taught a dangerous logic about forgiveness, and he was ready to challenge it in public. In 1516, the Catholic Church sent Friar Johann Tetzel to sell indulgences in the region, a sort of fundraising campaign. Believers paid a fee, received a certificate, and were assured their punishment for sins had been reduced. His sales pitch leaned on fear, grief, and urgency. It pressed the right emotional buttons, and Luther hated how well it worked. As a counter to this activity, Luther wrote 95 short points meant for debate, the famous 95 Theses. He aimed at what he saw as false confidence being sold to ordinary Christians. He even questioned whether the Pope could do what preachers like Tetzel implied. If salvation was God's gift received by faith, then no church campaign should train people to treat mercy like a product, he argued. On October 31st, 1517, he posted the theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. That could have stayed a local university argument, just another disputation among theologians. But Gutenberg invented the printing press decades before. and radical ideas now spread like wildfire. Printing turned a local dispute into a continent-wide group chat, and nobody could mute it. Translations circulated beyond Latin readers, and people who had never sat in a theology classroom started arguing about it in public. As the theses spread, church leaders could not tolerate a challenge that hinted the church's leadership in Rome might be wrong about how forgiveness worked. This was a dangerous dent into their authority, but also a threat to their ability to raise funds via indulgences. In 1518, Luther faced questioning, and the issue quickly widened beyond indulgences. The real battle now was over authority. Did the Pope and the councils have the final word, or did Scripture? Luther's answer only grew firmer. He argued that popes could make mistakes and that church traditions could drift, so Scripture had to sit at the top. By 1520, Rome issued a formal warning demanding that Luther retract key teachings. Luther refused and made the break public, burning the document in a symbolic act that everyone understood. In response, the Pope excommunicated him in January 1521. This meant he was to be treated like a heretic, cut off from society and work. Normally, this outcome spelled disaster. However, he made friends in high places, and the conflict shifted into imperial politics. Theology had become a public test of authority, and a showdown was next. The conflict now moved to the biggest stage available, the Holy Roman Empire itself. Luther was summoned to the Diet of Worms, an imperial assembly where political leaders and church representatives expected a clear outcome. His writings were placed before him, and he was told to recant. Luther understood what was at stake because the precedent of Jan Hus still hovered in the background. If he admitted his ideas were heretical, he could be crushed quickly. If he refused, he could be labeled an outlaw, which meant anyone could theoretically harm him without legal penalty. Still, he did not fold. He said he would change his mind only if he was convinced by Scripture, because he did not trust church authority to correct itself when it was wrong. The emperor issued an order declaring Luther outside legal protection. On paper, this looked like the beginning of the end. But in practice, it showed the limits of imperial power because Luther had a political guardian angel, Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. He took Luther into his protection at Wartburg Castle. This is why Luther didn't share the tragic fate of Jan Hus 100 years before. But why would Frederick gamble on what looked like a losing bet? Well, it was his way to assert independence from excessive papal and imperial control. You see, the Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of territories, princes, bishops, and cities, often competing with each other. Some German leaders resented money flowing to Rome and disliked outside influence. Even if they did not share Luther's theology, they saw advantage in resisting pressure to crush him. Frederick also believed Luther deserved a fair trial, not immediate condemnation, and wanted to prevent him from facing the fate of earlier reformers like Jan Hus. By shielding him, he also protected his university's prestige and Saxony's intellectual standing. Once Luther's ideas had protection and momentum, they stopped being only arguments and started becoming part of everyday life. If Scripture mattered most, people needed to hear it and understand it in their own language. Luther's 1522 German New Testament spread quickly and encouraged native language preaching across Lutheran areas. Worship changed. Church services moved toward the local language instead of Latin, and sermons grew in importance because teaching became central. Luther also promoted congregational singing and hymns that carried theology in plain words. It trained ordinary believers to think of themselves as active participants. Clergy life shifted too. Many reformers rejected mandatory celibacy, and Luther married Katharina von Bora, a former nun, turning his home into a visible model of pastor and family life. That image mattered because it narrowed the gap between clergy and laypeople. Education became a long-term engine. If believers were expected to understand the faith, literacy and instruction had to expand. In 1534, Luther's full German Bible appeared, giving the movement a durable foundation for worship, schooling, and family reading. The use of the printing press was crucial. Hans Luft, the printer in Wittenberg, produced more than 100,000 copies of the Luther Bible over 40 years. The initial cost of a complete Bible was a month's wages for an average laborer. However, widespread reprinting, sometimes unauthorized, flooded the market and increased accessibility over time. Luther's success didn't shield him from controversy, though. In the Peasants' War, 1524 to 1525, large numbers of peasants and townspeople rose up across parts of the German lands. Their complaints mixed economics and dignity, arguing that Christian freedom should also change social order. Luther hated the abuses peasants described, yet he feared the chaos of revolt even more. When violence spread, he condemned the rebellion and called on rulers to restore order with force. Many saw that as a moral failure. The man who challenged church power sounded like a defender of the existing political order. Perhaps Luther returned the favor to the political system that protected him in his own time of need. After all, he owed his life and safety to a political patron. Protestant unity also cracked quickly, as theological debates shaped worship and identity. It showed that Protestant would not be one neat new church. The Reformation multiplied into movements that could cooperate at times and compete at others. Luther's legacy carried a darker burden too. In his later years, his writings about Jews became harsh and hostile, especially in 1543. His rhetoric went beyond debate and became cruel, and later anti-Semites used his words as justification. This legacy made Luther's influence morally complicated. So you see, Martin Luther was a deeply human figure, full of contradictions, shaped by extraordinary circumstances that made him a hero to some and a villain to others. On a historical scale, the Reformation had major ripple effects. It reshuffled power, broke unity, and created new conflicts alongside new possibilities. In response to the growing division, European politics reorganized around religion. And the religious split turned into a map problem. Which regions would remain Catholic, which would become Lutheran, and what happened to minorities living under the wrong ruler? The Holy Roman Empire tried to manage this fracture without collapsing, and the result was a major initial settlement, the Peace of Augsburg, in 1555. It recognized Lutheranism as a legal option and, in practice, linked a territory's official religion to its ruler's choice. However, the split fed decades of tension and war across Europe. Catholic and Protestant powers fought for conviction, but also for land, security, and influence. The pressure culminated into the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, widely regarded as the most catastrophic conflict in Europe until the First World War. Its causes were complex and not purely religious, but Reformation-era divisions were a major ingredient. We'll tell the story of this war in another episode. One other major consequence of the Reformation was that state power shaped religion. That strengthened governments, but it also meant ordinary people's beliefs could be shaped or pressured by law. Another consequence was education and literacy. The Reformation drove a wider competition to teach, persuade, and form believers, which raised literacy and institutional learning across regions. Europeans lived with ongoing disagreement and learned, slowly and painfully, to build politics, economies, and communities without assuming religious unity. Luther's legacy spread into the New World as well in the following centuries, shaping the American worldview. So what mattered more, Luther's theology or the politics around it? Hard to say, but remember, the Reformation began with 95 problems, and indulgences were definitely one. Subscribe and indulge yourself with another video from our collection. The Reel of Time never stops. See you next time.